So we have here a season of Lent, and Lent is still very popular with what you would call your mainline traditions. Those would be like your old American kind of standard religions of like Lutherans, Methodists, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, that sort of main branch of denomination. But when churches became kind of more evangelical and they started moving to like big rock bands and like more theatrics, and they started moving away from pews and things were changing. Not saying one is better than the other, but one of the things lost, and I mean this wholeheartedly, one of the things lost was Lent. Lent is a season that has been historically rooted into preparing for baptism. It is a tradition that is crucial. It's been around for hundreds of years because we all recognized as time moved on, as our faith became not so much a secret society, but kind of became commercialized, would you say, right, by the governments of the time, right? Valentine's Day. Did anybody study about St. Valentine that day? No. And we did at Messy Church, but nobody studied Valentine because it became commercialized, right? But Lent was this season that became hard to commercialize because literally the idea of Lent is counter corporation. The idea of Lent is not to go out and buy stuff, but to give away what you have. It's not to go to a store and go shopping, but rather spend time alone in prayer. The practices of Lent do not lend corporations excitement, right? They're like, that's not fun. And the bigger churches that were kind of like focused on like entertaining people and making the church exciting and fun were like, we can't spend 7 weeks being depressed. That will just make us all depressed. And that wasn't so popular. But the mainline traditions, we are like, no, we are sticking to the tradition of Lent. This is important. This is healthy. Why? Because nobody is perfect. And we need dedicated holidays and seasons or traditions. It's just how humans are, to reflect and to let go and to be raw and honest, to come before God. And God uses crude language there, even in the Old Testament. So I'm not even talking 2,000 years. I'm talking even older. So that language we read in Deuteronomy, where it says to circumcise, in front of your heart, we know what they're talking about. We're talking about your stinky parts, right? And the Bible's using some crude language. Even they were like, no, you need a season and a time to get real with your God. To actually come before God and say, I'm not feeling right. What's not feeling right? Some of you might know. So sometimes, when we have communion, I have the opportunity where we list out kind of the common day sins, our common sins. But we also have this quiet time of your heart. And we say, well, what's sitting inside my heart today? What doesn't feel right with God? Was there something I said to somebody I shouldn't have? Was I not being nice? And some people come into a season of Lent like, oh gosh, I really need to work on this behavior. This has been keeping me from loving my God. Other people are like, I don't know. Let me sit with my God. And that's why you would go to a moment of prayer. So we have this season of Lent where we try to work out things and turn back to God and God's ways. And we don't do it necessarily with big celebrations until we get to our big Easter. And I think personally, Easter loses its feelings and its wonders when we don't have a season of Lent. Just in the same way Christmas loses its feelings. You ever have a Christmas where somebody's just totally focused on them and then Christmas happens and it's still just about them and they're like, nothing's changed, right? Like, they missed the point. There was the Advent season where we were giving away, where we were in the middle of winter when it was cold and we want to hide in our blankets, hosting parties and welcoming people, right? You missed the point. So here again, we are going to be living into this season of shedding and letting go. And this can be hard because some people are like, well, I think the church is doing I'm good. We know God has the final word, we're good. We just need to live into that goodness and just call it a day. But I don't think that's necessarily the case. I get the allure, but I don't get it. We humans, we do this whenever there's a discussion of power or authority. We're like, we don't need to talk about that. It's fine, it's fine. And we try to push and shove things away. And those things become barriers or walls in our spiritual life and with God. One of those, and I'm just as guilty as the next. I remember as a young person, growing up, I went to the Martin Luther King March, and I think some of you have heard this one before, on January 13, 2012. I was an AmeriCorps representative, and I drove a Habitat for Humanity family in my car, and I had another Habitat for Humanity. And we drove to the Martin Luther King March, and I was very excited. We had an interesting childhood. I had many different adults being in foster care and things, but my birth grandmother married, and this is a big deal in the 70s, a black man. And I brought pictures of my grandma and my grandpa. There's not many, but this is my grandpa here. It was the 70s, so he's teaching, I think, my uncle how to roll cigarettes. But this is my family photos. And he was a big black guy. And then when my mom moved over here to Spokane, I remember we were excited because they came into Spokane, and they got off the plane, and they were hungry, and so we went to lunch. And my grandma was there, and I was just excited to see my grandpa and grandpa. I knew my grandpa was black. I came from a predominantly white, Irish kind of family, but I just thought he was like Will Smith. Like, literally, that was my thought of what a black person was like Will Smith. Like, no big deal. And my grandpa had served in war. He had a war injury, so he was a veteran. So, like, I didn't think anything of it other than he was just this big black grandpa. And we go into a restaurant, and this is the early 90s, and I'm in there with my grandma, and this woman, I'll never forget, in the bathroom, I was like 9 or 10, turns around and calls my grandmother an end-lubber, and tells her to get out. And this is in Spokane in the 90s. And I had never heard that word. We don't use that word, you know. And I remember my grandma's hand shaking. And as a child, this woman who I loved, my grandma was 6'2". She was a tall, blonde woman from, Chicago. Like, I thought of her as artsy and fancy. And compared to my mom, she was on class. Like, she was awesome. And I remember her hands sweating, like, what do we do, And there was this angry woman. So fast forward, time moves on, and we're now in 2012, and it's like the season of hope, right? Like, Obama is getting elected. Like, it's like, oh my gosh, we've turned this corner, America. We're doing better. Like, black people are being seen for who they are. They're intelligent, they're caring fathers, they're loving people. Like, we have turned this corner. So I go to the march on 2012, and I'm celebrating. I'm in a celebratory mood. And I get the celebratory churches, right? You want to celebrate. And then, as we're going down the march route, the route gets rerouted. This isn't the usual Martin Luther King march. It gets moved off course. And sure enough, that year, there was a bomb planted in Spokane on the Martin Luther King march in 2012. And when you go to look at said bombs and stuff, you'll see a picture of a little blue car that I parked just a block away from the bomb. The FBI blocked off the zone, and then I remember the march was over, and I didn't know what to do. I had a Habitat family there and a coworker. The Habitat family called, they were Ukrainian, they called some family friends, picked them up. I was kind of in a state of shock, and I just started walking home, which was the silly thing, because I lived past Whitworth. This was downtown. But I was in a state of shock, and hear me out, I had a poor childhood. We were not encouraged to go talk to the police, right? So my natural instinct was not to go up to the police officer and say, hey, can I have my car back? My natural instinct was like, time to go. And so I just started walking. And also, just so you know, I was young, and I do absent-minded things to this day, but I hadn't paid my tabs, right? So my tabs were expired, And if you park next to a bomb, they'll still give you a ticket, just so you know. So when I did eventually get my car back 2 days later, I also had a ticket for the tax, just in case that ever happens for you. So life goes on. But I remember this, like once I got home and I realized, and Kevin picked me up and he's like, why are you walking home? What are you doing? And I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just not going back there. So Kevin picks me up and things settle down and I get my car and I pay the ticket and I get my tabs and I'm processing and I'm like, no, I think America still has some work to do. I think we have some work to do. And I don't think the work necessarily begins with laws, but I do think we have some spiritual work left to do. That there is this corrosion of hate and hating your neighbor. And I feel like that sentiment has picked up. We talked about, I don't know if you've ever heard, but for Martin Luther King, he carried with him to most of his rallies Howard Thurman's book. And Howard Thurman wrote this book in 1949, and he wrote a book about the disinherited. And he talks about, I always distinctly remember, it's basically an apology. Why do Christians keep getting this wrong? Why do Christians keep hating? Why in America, the land of opportunity, do we still want to hurt one another? Why does this keep happening? And even in my own head, I'm like, why does this keep happening? You guys need to get over it. You're not as good at basketball. Just get over it. No, why do we keep hating our neighbor? And he comes up with the 3 hounds of hell. And psychologists have even started studying it to this day and pointing to the parts of the brain that flare up to those 3 hounds of hell. Do any of you remember what they are? They're famous. Okay. The first hound of hell, and so obviously he's talking about when the hounds would chase after people and the evilness that they would create. The first hound is fear. So when you begin to talk about love or loving God the way that Jesus loved everybody, or the way that Jesus cared for the Samaritan, or cared for the woman who was about to be stoned, when you try to love radically like Jesus, one of the first stumbling blocks is the fear. And it's more than just a fear of survival. People will initially go to that. They'll say, well, I need this to survive, or I need that, or I need that. It's a little deeper than that. It's fear that they will die without dignity, that their life had no purpose, no meaning, that they couldn't follow through, or that their family, because they had some relative who did something bad or wrong, that they should be ashamed. Which, again, is not Christian. Because if we go back to the Gospel of Matthew, like we were talking about earlier, the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus even has a hooker as a great-grandmother. Literally. It is our tradition to love you as you are. Doesn't matter if your family got it right every time. It's not about having guilt or anything like that. It's a matter of just coming honestly before God. Coming with a raw. And not being afraid of whatever fear society shames or puts on you. Really, what I want isn't fear of going to hell or fear of this or fear of that. No. What my heart is needing is to be close to God. Because I know deep down, that's where my peace is found. It's not people-pleasing. It's not looking good on Facebook. It's not any of that. I breathe and I sleep well when I'm right with God. You can only get right with God if you can only start by being honest. And you can't be honest if you're afraid to speak the truth. The second thing is deception. The second hound of hell. And I think deception is everywhere. And he does a really interesting thing, really advanced psychology for his time. Howard does this. He talks about how common, especially Christians, we mimic behavior to get along, to blend in. We mimic it. And he says you can point to animals that'll do this, bugs that'll mimic, right? Certain critters. Little fish, when they come together, what are they trying to do? They're trying to mimic a big fish, right? And humans do this. And he said what's sad is stop doing? You stop being yourself, right? And so right there, the second hound of hell, how do you love your neighbor if you don't already know how to love yourself, right? So it's this deep, deep truth of, play with me a little bit. Since you're older, I can play with you a little more. I want to be like this group, so I'm going to stop being myself and I'm going to be like this group. I already don't love who I am. Then somebody in this group calls forth the truth, right? Sometimes it's the scapegoat, the child in the family that always spoke the truth, right, when they shouldn't. And I get mad at this person. Why? And I'm treating them the way I have treated myself. I'm telling them to not love themselves. I'm telling them to not speak their truth. Why? Because I already told myself to do the same. I already told myself I'm not worth it. And now I'm telling this person, through deception, to no longer love who they are. And you can see the tear between us and God begins to happen, right? It began with fear, and it becomes more because we've stopped loving ourselves and we're just trying to mimic a group. And we're trying to be less and less. There was all of these talks about whether or not, like, Jesus would never go into a church and get mad at people. Are you kidding me? Jesus did that in the Bible. Even people try so hard to make Jesus something Jesus is not, right? They want the fishes to all look like this one. But the truth is bigger than that. It's complex. It's deeper. There's more to the story. And the third hound of hell, so it's fear, deception, or lies. The third one is hatred. Hatred starts out as a defense mechanism, right? Initially, hatred is like, come. It's okay to hate them. They're dirty, or they're not treating their kids right, or blah, 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 right? It's easy to hate that group over there. And it feels like a defense mechanism, but it grows, and it gets gross, and it gets ugly, and it gets worse. And I have an example of this. For instance, there was a lot of, and I just didn't like this about society, so one of my Lenten practices is stop watching the news. They were talking about, how could immigrant parents take their kids across the border, blah, blah, blah. I had a foster daughter with me. Her biological dad was Mexican, and the biological mother was from the U.S., but of Mexican descent, and she is a U.S. citizen. And this foster daughter's sister had watched, because they had lived in Mexico for most of their life, and then they came back here when the gangs got so bad. They watched her stepdad, the other foster daughter's sister, her sister, sorry. The dad had been killed by the rival gangs and waterlogged. And they had witnessed horrific deaths by the mafia, horrific deaths. And this mother took her kids with nothing left. They tried to fight, they did. But at some point, the mom was like, this isn't working, I want a better life for my child. And she leaves. And so it becomes hard, so when I watch the news, it's like, how could a parent do that? I'm like, what are you talking about? Those parents just want a better life for their kid, or maybe safety, or safe passage. How is it any different than Jesus, right? Mary running to Egypt? How is this any different? Safe passage. In the Old Testament and the New Testament. And it's hard because there's even legislation, I kid you not, brought before the Idaho legislator trying to make it illegal to help an immigrant. And I'm going to tell you right now, if I see a child in need, I don't care what the citizenship is. I will help said child, and I will do it with the good graces of my God, because my God commands me to love everyone. End of story. The widow and the orphan. End of story. And so we come to this crux of, how could we? We have gotten so far from our values, so far from our history. I think that we need a season of Lent now more than ever. It is not Christian to hate your neighbor. It is not Christian to fear your neighbor. And it is not Christian to make up lies about your neighbor. These are the 3 hounds of hell. These are what we are called to shed during the season of Lent. And these have been needing to be shed every year. We get off track. We lose our way. We forget our history. My prayer for all of you, when I think about this week, and I think about the season of Lent, is don't let hate grow. Don't let fear grow in your hearts. If you notice that stirring of ick or I shouldn't like them, cut it out. Circumcise that business. That's not of God. That's not holy. That's not loving. That doesn't help us get closer to God. Now, the things that will get us closer to God is a harder road. We will not be the most popular. We won't be the funnest one in the room always. You might be that child in a family that says what needs to be said, and the child gets in trouble because they brought, religion or politics to the table. But I'm going to encourage you during the season of Lent, just as Amos reminds us, where he says, I don't care for your gongs, I don't care for your celebrations, let justice roll down. I'm done. Let justice roll down. And if you believe in God, and you believe that God is the highest power, it's not about me or you. God has been doing this for a very long time. And God's ways will have the end of the word. Because if you think the redhead is stubborn, wait till you meet your Creator. Amen?